Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Kahlil here today, and Kahlil is a guest of Sarah Townsend here, who very kindly suggested that he come and visit us, and I'm very excited to hear your talk. Kahlila Chaar-Pérez is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pittsburgh through the Department of Hispanic Literatures and Languages, or rather, sorry, Hispanic, which one comes first? Languages and literatures. Mm-hmm. They get them confused all the time.
All the time.
His work specializes in Caribbean and Latin American modern and contemporary literatures and cultures. And he recently co-edited a special issue of Discourse, the Discourse Journal, on Edward Glissant. He's currently working on a book project about Creole intellectuals, anti-colonial politics, and visions of colonial crisis in 19th century Cuba and Puerto Rico. And his talk today is called Revolutionary Indians, Ramón Emeterio Betances and the Specters of 19th Century Caribbean Patriotism. So please join me in welcoming Kahlil.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks to Sarah Townsend for inviting me here, and to the Department of Complit, and thank you, all of you, for being here. Today I'll talk about the revolutionary aesthetics and politics of the 19th century Puerto Rican intellectual Ramón Emeterio Betances. Betances stood out among his fellow Cuban and Puerto Rican revolutionaries for his singular experiences of dislocation. He lived most of his life in France and wrote most of his texts in French. He included Haiti and Jamaica within his vision of a Caribbean federation of states, and he was of African descent. However, much of his work, travels, and revolutionary vision remains unexplored as part of the region's literary, intellectual, and political history. To this end, I will look at several texts and key moments in the life story of Betances with the aim of examining his romantic prophecy of fraternal love and anti-colonial revolution in connection to his multiple selves, particularly his affiliations with France and Haiti and his ambiguous racial identity. My interest in Betances stems from a broader concern with the formation of Caribbean anti-colonial publics and projects of decolonization in the region. I've been intrigued by the relative absence of sustained comparative studies of Cuban and Puerto Rican colonial history, with the exception of the work of Carlos Rama, Luis Martinez Fernandez, Christopher Schmidt-Nowara, and Josiana Arroyo. Why this continuing silence when both islands shared a significant relationship as the last two Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere after the Hispanic American Wars of Independence? Colonial society did develop differently in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but the cultural and political connections between Puerto Rican and Cuban elites ran deeply. Cuban and Puerto Rican elite subjects interacted and collaborated frequently through inter-Caribbean, hemispheric, and transcontinental networks of symbolic and material production. Yet, in researching Cuba and Puerto Rico, scholars have, for the most part, adopted insular, nation-centric approaches without addressing how the concepts of nationhood and nationalism are suitable, if in fact they are, for 19th century and 19th century Puerto Rican and Cuban studies. The end result has been the reproduction of lineal progressive narratives that begin with the first representations of Creole culture, that is, explicitly Puerto Rican or Cuban forms of identification, as the emerging signs of cultural nationalism, which lead then to the analysis of the development of a national ethos whose full expression is associated with political independence. Such narratives neglect the actual processes of Creole elite self-definition, which intertwine affective investment with political strategy, often in fluid, ambivalent ways. In fact, there was never a uniform conception of the homeland or patria among Cuban and Puerto Rican intellectuals until the end of the 19th century. Patriotic ideals ranged from the formation of an exclusively white autonomous territory under the protection of Spain to a racially harmonious sovereign state. Also, patriotic sentiment was not bound necessarily to the islands. Many non-revolutionary Creoles viewed Spain as their madre patria, their homeland, at the same time that they affirmed a distinctive sense of Cubanidad or Puerto Ricanness. At the same time, revolutionary patriots located the patria beyond the island's physical territory. For instance, José Martí alludes explicitly to this form of the patria in his 1891 speech at the Cuban Lyceum in Tampa, Florida. To the homeland that falls apart there and has been blinded from decay, one must bring the compassionate, foresighted homeland that arises here. In the case of Martí, Betances, and the revolutionary comrades, the ideals of the patria resided among the exiled communities, which were expected to liberate and purify the alienated social body of the colony. The story of Betances' transatlantic ventures begins in 1837, when he was sent at the age of 10 to pursue his education in France. During an 18-year-long stay, Betances lived in Toulouse and Paris, where he studied medicine and witnessed the French Revolution of 1848, as well as the creation of the Second Republic, which after 3 years was overthrown, of course, by Napoleon III. In an 1898 interview titled Memories of a Revolutionary, Betances asserts that his first political experience was supporting the revolution. And he says, "I am also an old soldier of the French Republic. In 1848, I fulfilled my duty. When liberty is at stake, all peoples unite in solidarity." Betances sees 1848 as a foundational moment in his formation as a political activist and thinker. He identifies himself as an agent of the revolution's Republican values and affiliation. He translates as a cosmopolitan discourse of freedom. Betances also identified with the Second Republic's abolitionist politics. Under the leadership of Victor Schweitzer, the Republican government abolished slavery, declaring that the enslaved peoples in the colonies were to become French citizens. In 1855, Betances returned to Puerto Rico, where his participation in a secret abolitionist society led shortly to his political exile. During the next decade, Betances embraced the cause of political independence, becoming one of the chief organizers of the Grito de Lares, a short-lived rebellion in his homeland. As the Cuban 10 Years' War against Spain exploded in 1868, Betances began a prolonged transatlantic journey in support of the revolutionary and abolitionist causes, traveling through New York City, Caracas, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and again back to Paris in 1875. Here, Betances continued to pursue his political vision. He was the Dominican government's official diplomat for several years, became one of the leaders of the Society of Latin American Union, which served the interests of the exiled community, and also served as the French representative of the Cuban Revolutionary Party until his death. The legacy of Betances in Puerto Rico has been limited, for the most part, to his prominent role in the struggle for independence, and separatists often acclaim him as El Padre de la Patria, Puerto Rico's founding father. The revolutionary vision of Betances can be traced back to a key text he wrote in the 1850s, a novella titled The Two Indians, an episode in the conquest of Borinquen. Written in French, The Two Indians was published under the pseudonym of Louis Raymond in Toulouse in 1857. The circulation of this novella was apparently limited, although it is mentioned in the first bibliography of Puerto Rican literature published 30 years later. Since then, The Two Indians has remained a forgotten document in Puerto Rican and Caribbean literary history, even though it was one of the first book-length fiction narratives written by a Puerto Rican. In this regard, The Two Indians exemplifies the marginal status of the literature of Betances in the Puerto Rican canon, where he's reduced to the status of his revolutionary activism. In reading closely The Two Indians, we can delineate not only the intricate relationship between romantic aesthetics and politics in Betances, but also how his patriotic vision diverged in significant ways from other more prominent revolutionaries, in particular José Martí, with whom he has been traditionally compared to. As its subtitle indicates, The Two Indians depicts an episode of the Spanish conquest in mid-16th century Borinquen, the indigenous name for Puerto Rico. The novella is constructed through a basic opposition, the struggle of two young Indians of noble origin, the brothers Otuque and Toba, against the Spanish conquistadors. The plot begins in media res, with the brothers walking through a forest as they hunt a wild boar. Toba leaves the scene in order to let his younger brother claim the boar, but Otuke is suddenly dazed by a gunshot and captured by the Spaniards. While imprisoned, Otuke meets and falls in love with Carmen, the Spanish daughter of Don Pedro, the outpost captain. Against her father's wishes, Carmen heals Otuke, and they both escape, seeking asylum in the mountains among the Maroon native communities. When Toba denounces his brother for consorting with the enemy, the novella takes a tragic turn. Ashamed of his love of Carmen and his brother's rejection, Otuke proceeds to kill himself. Then, as a squadron of conquistadors follows Toba, he becomes a sublime force of vengeful destruction and annihilates all the Spaniards, disappearing into the depths of the tropical forest. In a melancholic aftermath, Carmen gives birth to Otuke's son and dies soon after. The novella, however, concludes with a glimmer of hope as Toba blesses his brother's child and accepts him as one of his own. At first glance, the plot and aesthetic form of The Two Indians evoke late 18th and 19th century romantic fictions of tropical colonialism and the indigenous other. The island's landscape is idealized as a primordial space of sublimity, which is in turn linked to the identity of its native inhabitants. It is probable that Betances read and was influenced by French fantasies of primitivism, such as Atala, Paul Virginie, and Indiana. A similar literary tradition developed in the Americas as writers romanticized the so-called Indian at the same time that Native American communities were excluded symbolically and physically from the emergent nation states. Yet, The Two Indians differs in key aspects from these traditions. Neither Otuke nor Toba fit the conventional image of the native as a pure, primitive being that will be inevitably displaced by the colonizer and Eurocentric modernity. The novella places the native brothers at the very center of the plot, not only privileging the indigenous self as a heroic agent of action, but also focalizing the narrative through their perspective against the Spaniards. The narrator frames the storyline explicitly as a moral conflict between oppressors and oppressed. The Indians are described as an independent, heroic people, in contrast to the villainous Spaniards and their desire for gold. Meanwhile, Otuke and Toba are presented as complex, emotionally conflicted characters. On the one hand, Otuke and Toba exemplify the fraternal love that Betances links to the cause for independence in the Caribbean. Yet, the desire for sovereignty takes different forms in each character. And I quote, "The two brothers had, so to speak, split their passions, melancholy in one, unremitting hatred in the other. Melancholy and hatred originate in the spirit of both of their love for freedom." While Otuke's identity is shaped through the inward gaze of the melancholic, Toba's identity is expressed externally as hateful violence against the Spaniards. The split feelings of Otuke and Toba represent in this manner an intricate interplay of passions in a dialectical configuration of embodied affect that incorporates fraternal love and negative feelings to hopefully obtain that lost object that they and Betances seek to recuperate. Yet, in the novella, this apparent split leads, sorry, I'm hungry. Yet in the novella, this apparent split leads to a tragic rupture and the dissolution of brotherly love when Toba condemns Otuke's love for Carmen. Whoever is capable among the warriors to love his invaders becomes, because of this, a sacrilege, a traitor. Such a man has lost all patriotic instinct. To him, nothing seems worthy of being loved. This love must be fought with the noble sentiment of the freedom of his country. In Toba's uncompromising vision, romantic love, especially toward the enemy, is to be sacrificed for the fraternal bonds of revolutionary patriotism. The contradictions of radical of this radical articulation of patriotism are staged thus. How can a passionate attachment to the homeland entail turning one's brother into the enemy, dissolving the very fraternal bond that constitutes the patria? Does the novella critique the radical discourse of vengeful retribution as embodied in the figure of Toba? The narrator does not intervene to pass judgment on the actions of the protagonists, leaving the reader to reach their own conclusions. The narrative's melancholic ending would appear to reproduce a tragic logic of colonial repetition. In her last words, a despondent Carmen revealed foreboding omens to the natives. Leave. Courage and desperation will be impotent. Borinquen will be like a calf bound to its yoke. On the one hand, Carmen and Otuque can be read as an embodiment of the colonial structures of subjection that continue to haunt the history of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. On the other hand, the birth of Carmen and Otuque's child represents a sign of hope beyond colonial melancholy. In incorporating his nephew into his world, Toba breaks with his radical antagonism and embraces the possibility of a relationship with the Spanish other beyond colonialism. The novella ends with Toba's blessing of the child. He will live in the forests. He will be of the race of Aymá and the child of Borinquen. Through these words, the two Indians suggest an alternate future for the island as the offspring of his brother and Carmen. Toba's adopted son not only embodies the resurrection of Otuque and Toba's fraternal and patriotic love, but also resignifies fraternity as an interracial bond. This mestizo child is not to be assimilated into the colonial order. Just as Carmen leaves the colonial settlement in a burst of romantic passion, he will become an inhabitant of the forest, a space associated in Caribbean colonial history with maroon communities of Black and indigenous refugees. Curiously, the child is left unnamed. His identity is projected onto a future yet to be written, an open-ended futurity where Betances would then inscribe his revolutionary signature as El Antillano, the Caribbean, the anonymous pen name he used in many of his pamphlets and essays. The ending of the novella could be then read as a critique of Toba's radical antagonism as well as Otuque's melancholic narcissism. As split bodies, they stage the romantic tragedy of colonialism, but combined in memory, they supplement and attenuate each other's excess, suggesting another future. Another singular element in the two Indians is the romance between Carmen and Otuque. When portrayed in the Latin American literature of the time, interracial desire and sexuality were depicted almost exclusively between a native woman and a white Creole or Spaniard. In addition, indigenous men were characterized either as innocent or as a violent menace to national harmony. Betances' decision to portray Carmen and Otuque as runaway lovers repositions the Indian other as the nation's symbolic father. At the same time, it situates the female Spaniard subject as a passive receptacle for Borinquen's afterlife. Love can conquer all in this romantic fantasy, but through a distinctively masculine register that ends with Toba as a compassionate patriarch of a male child. Echoing the male-dominated anti-colonial network through which Betances advanced his cause, revolutionary agencies reduce here to the sphere of masculinity, a homosocial culture of virility that aspires to protect the homeland conventionally gendered as feminine. For insurgents such as Betances, male anxiety accompanied the ideal of affirming political sovereignty. To not participate in the revolutionary project entailed a symbolic lack, the absence of what José Martí famously calls character, which they equated with effeminacy. Betances' romantic rewriting of colonial history in the two Indians as an open-ended revolution of manly feelings goes hand in hand with the spirit of revolutionary fraternity he invokes in his future writings, what he would later call a revolution of love. In an 1868 pamphlet titled To Puerto Ricans, Betances declares his eternal and inalterable love for the freedom of all, the veneration of all republican virtues, a fraternal compassion for subjected peoples of all races and classes. I offer my heart and my life to you. O my brothers, and my inflexible hate for all tyrants, whoever they are. Although this pamphlet is dedicated to the Puerto Rican people, its discourse situates the colonial predicament, both slavery and colonial subjection, within a broader Republican struggle for emancipation. Through this movement from the local to the cosmopolitan, Betances' passionate investment in the political future of Puerto Rico translates into a declaration against all tyrants in the world. The cry for freedom for all is articulated against the other of tyranny, exemplified by the figure of what he calls the American Minotaur, in other words, the US. It is through this emancipatory call that Betances develops his arguments for a Caribbean federation, signaling the increasing threat of the United States in the region. Even as the cry for freedom appears to transcend all racial boundaries, Betances alludes explicitly to people of African descent as a central group of the subjected people he defends. The role of blackness in Betances is a thorny issue. Betances never identified himself racially in his public writings. Yet in a personal letter to his sister Demetria, he deplores the racial discrimination his family confronted in Puerto Rico, affirming his and her sister's identity as Prieto and Prietusco, which translate loosely as dark-skinned. Also, Betances developed a close relationship with Haiti and its history. He translated a celebrated U.S. abolitionist speech dedicated to the Haitian leader Toussaint Louverture, wrote a positive biography of the first Haitian president, Alexandre Pétion, and lived in the coastal town of Jacmel between 1871 and 1873. After relocating to Paris, he collaborated with the Haitian exile community, continuing to write about Haiti as he developed close friendships with Haitian intellectuals such as Antonin Fragma, who wrote the anti-racist treatise on the equality of races. Betances' positive appraisal of Haiti is made evident in an 1874 article where he describes Haiti as the vanguard of Latin American republics, the nation that has already proclaimed the principle that we must avow time and again, for it is the one principle that holds true for our islands, the Antilles for the Antilleans. According to Betances, the Caribbean colonies should follow the path of Haiti's struggle against slavery and colonialism and proclaim political sovereignty as a moral principle. At the same time, this ideal transcends the limits of the nation, uniting all the Antillean islands. This view differed from that of the great majority of the local elites in Cuba and Puerto Rico, who regarded Haiti as a reminder of the possibility of a black revolution in their homeland. Even leaders like José Martí and Eugenio María de Hostos excluded Haiti from their visions of Caribbean unity. While Betances did not render his affinity with Haiti as an explicitly racial connection, the specter of blackness hovers over his text. As I suggested, in the case of the two Indians, the image of the forest evokes the social practices of survival and resistance of maroon communities, which were populated by both indigenous and black peoples. In the lyrical poem that follows the novella in its first edition, titled Tu Borinquen, this association is made more directly. Throughout most of the poem, the speaker laments in typical romantic fashion the Spaniards' decimation of the native inhabitants and the enslavement of Africans, suggesting again the tragic logic of colonial repetition. In the last stanza, however, the speaker's melancholy is suddenly suspended. But watch, under the thick brush of that steep rock, who is this shivering body? Who might the lookout be? It is the Indian. In the distance, deep in the forest, very far from the trail, who might that man of the shadowy forehead be? It is the black man who lends him his hand. They are slaves, they are brothers, both bound under the yoke, with the same prayers, with the same gods. For you they make the same vows, Borinquen, beloved Borinquen. They cry out in unison, humankind, when will the homeland be reborn finally with the spring of liberty? The figures of the Indian and the black man are united here in different forms, physically as concealed subjects, historically through a genealogy of subjection, and effectively through compassion, patriotic love, and melancholy. Even as they're separated in space, they become one voice through the melancholic veneration of freedom. As in the two Indians, the melancholic gaze turns towards the ruins of colonial history. The melancholic gaze towards the ruins of colonial history dissolves into emancipatory hope, interrupted by the speaker's prophetic declaration of a spring of liberty. The poem's performance of anti-colonial remembrance determines the future under the sign of restoration and freedom represented by Betances' revolutionary project. When looking at his works together, the political form of this project, however, is not entirely clear. Like Martí, Betances never developed a detailed map of how a Caribbean federation of republics would look like, beyond fragmentary allusions to the ideals of French republicanism. I'd like to conclude by sketching a temporary answer to this question by way of one of Betances' longest texts, his biography of Alexandre Pétion. Titled To a Free Cuba, this 1871 essay translates the subject of Haiti for the Hispanic Caribbean reading public through the great man narrative popularized in the Romantic era. The text places Pétion at the center stage of what Betances calls the drama of Haitian liberty, dismissing the significance of other leading figures of the Haitian Revolution, including Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Pétion first made his mark as a general for the French Republican forces before changing sides when Napoleon reinstituted slavery in the colony. After the death of Dessalines, he was president of the Republic in southern Haiti from 1806 to 1818, while King Christophe ruled the north as king. Betances praises the liberal policies implemented under Pétion, particularly the establishment of a free labor regime and the redistribution of plantation plots among the peasantry. In addition, he views Pétion as a figure who transcended the dilemma of racial difference in Haiti, fostering unity between Noirs and Mulâtres, blacks and mulattoes. Pétion, it should be noted, identified as Mulâtre. In other words, for Betances, Pétion did not represent a mere political leader, he was Haiti's founding father, a messianic being through which the people of Haiti were able to unite in harmony after the tyranny of Dessalines and Christophe. Betances' rosy depiction of Pétion as a pure Democrat and as Haiti's great citizen does not address the authoritarian excesses of the first president of the Republic. The Constitution of 1816 strengthened the president's executive powers, giving him the authority to name his successor and the right to occupy the position for life. If anything, Betances appears to support Pétion in this regard when he alludes, without any explanation, to the fact that Pétion worried as dictator about the individual security and the freedom of everybody. Having been written with Cuba and Puerto Rico in mind, such contradictions can be explained off as pragmatic choices, strategic erasures that serve Betances' politics of regional and racial unity in opposition to U.S. interventionism. At the same time, such strategies also involve the sphere of feeling. In an impassioned passage, Betances writes about the reconciliation of two iconic enemies of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture and the Mulâtre military leader of the French army, André Rigaud. He describes how Rigaud, while imprisoned in France along with Louverture, consoled his former enemy. This moment, which is apparently fictional, represents for Betances a symbol of peace between all of the children of the intelligent but unfortunate race that gives life to the Antilles and the Gulf of Mexico. It is the only way of resisting the war that has declared against us Europe and even part of America, a war of centuries, a war of the present, the same war which can only survive through the most sincere union and closest fraternity. In this passage, Betances reiterates his romantic vision of Caribbean belonging, a community that transcends the limits of homeland and race in direct resistance against empire. Through this call, the work of Betances intersects with a genealogy of radical anti-racist and anti-colonial politics that in the 20th century will be associated with Black internationalism, decolonization, tricontinentalism, and today with global South activism. Perhaps the most striking element in Betances' trajectory is the prominence of the project of a Caribbean federation, a concept that deserves more attention as we trace the prehistory of the global South. And remember, as Frederick Cooper and Gary Wilder have argued respectively in Africa and the World and Freedom Time, that decolonial imaginaries do not follow necessarily a developmental logic of national self-determination and post-colonial sovereignty. Although the rhetoric of national sovereignty is definitely present in Betances, his emphasis on a regional and planetary framework for revolution, shared also by his friend Antenor Varma, allow us to rethink the genealogy of decolonization and anti-colonial patriotism as it intersects with other genealogies of belonging, such as Betances' liberal cosmopolitanism and his affinity with the French Republican tradition, which will be echoed later in the work of future Afro-Francophone intellectuals ranging from Aimé Césaire to Léopold Senghor. As I have pointed out, these transversal affinities produce their own structures of feeling, which are projected onto the formation of, to borrow the title of Leela Gandhi's book, affective communities across time and space. Following Wilder's analysis of the untimely projects of Senghor and Césaire, how their federal visions failed yet linger on as potentialities to be illuminated again from the future, we might contemplate how the unfulfilled dreams of decolonization of Betances can still enlighten the historical present of the Caribbean, even as we also consider the limitations of romantic great man counter-narratives and the ways in which they might summon the ghosts of tyranny. Thanks.
Thanks very much for your talk. That was really compelling. And actually, turns out I want to reflect on those final lines in thinking about this, let's say, early post-imperial or early anti-imperial romance and its sort of dialectical romance, right, of break and repetition. You mentioned Toulouse a couple of times. And this is a very small thing, but I think it might be interesting all the same. In terms of the kind of transnational networks that you're describing, that produce a kind of temporality, and this is what I'm interested in. The role of Toulouse is a kind of interesting little placeholder, right? In thinking about a kind of allegory of temporality within the French Revolutionary context, right? If we have Paris as like sort of the sign of the fragility of revolutions, right? It's something that Betances is sort of living through, right? Recognizing that there is the important break, but also the fact that revolutions are going to come and go. Toulouse is an interesting site because of its kind of role as the sign for romance itself, right? I mean, it's the sign of a kind of trans-temporal long history, right? The long duration of romance time, haunted by the Cathars being squashed and the Albigensians being laid waste, and the sort of the history of the Languedoc region being one of a kind of separate set of cultures, right, somehow, within France itself. And it's interesting to think that, what separates the Les Deux Indiens from like James Fenimore Cooper, for crying out loud, strikes me as this invocation in the very language of romance, right, of that combination or the dialectical relation between break, right, which ironically produced by fraternity, and reproduction and repetition produced by, biological reproduction. And it strikes me that there's a geographical component of this working too. And so again, it just struck me as interesting. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because I'd love you to say some more about this idea of Betances sort of laying out a temporality, right? Again, you could talk to a messianic horizon, but it's also a romantic one that sort of harkens to the longer duration of survival, as opposed to, while recognizing, let's say, the necessary imminence of a revolutionary break. And this seems to be what you're ending with, so maybe this question is entirely already said.
Well, yeah, there's a lot going on, and those are really, really good observations, Jonathan. And the question of Toulouse versus Paris, I think it's very important. Sadly, in terms of the actual documents that are available, Betances barely mentions Toulouse. It has a very marginal role. At the same time, that's where he grew up. That's where he actually had his adolescence. But he, in the text that I referred to, Memories of a Revolutionary, he only mentions Paris, and throughout his text, Paris repeatedly appears as number one, a space of, again, fraternal relationships, fraternal love, in a very explicit way. And he actually very explicitly identifies Paris as a form of homeland for him, a place where, and I mentioned the Society of Latin American Union, which is like a really fascinating social space. You had Latin American diplomats, Haitian intellectuals, and political exile in the society. It deserves actually a book-length history, and it was created in the 1870s, and to my knowledge, it still existed in the early 1900s. And the secretary of the society was a Haitian intellectual. Antonin Firmin was very active. He was the political candidate for the Liberal Party in Haiti in the first presidential elections of the 20th century in Haiti. So for Betances, Paris has that sense that you will see again later during throughout the 20th century for African American exiles, also Latin American exiles, coming together and thinking about their affinities in shaping projects of revolution across the globe that were not limited to to nationhood. In the question of temporality, I see where you're going with the case of Toulouse, and also think of the relationship between the French provinces and Paris and their place in the idea of revolution, which is always associated with Paris as the radical center of revolutionary movements in the country, in the nation, the French nation. While the country side is actually seen as reactionary. Toulouse, it's a complicated place. I think it's sort of in between those more reactionary forces. But it's something that I like. I think deserves more thought in relationship to Betances. And in a broader sense, the question of temporality, it brings up the issue of a word that I'm not sure if I mentioned, the issue of prophecy and romantic prophecy. There's a book by Ian Balfour, which is a beautiful book it's titled The Rhetoric of Romantic Prophecy. So the title basically gives you it's a very explicit title, very clear title. It gives you a sense of, he explores the temporality of prophecy and how there's a non-synchronous aspect to prophecy and going back, the gaze backwards and how it collapses the traditional rational chronology, past, present, future. And it is something that Gary Wilder deals with through Walter Benjamin, the figure of the Angelus Novus, the ideas of Benjamin in the thesis of the philosophy of history, where he talks about the ruins of history and how gazing back and re-illuminating those ruins of the past, we can bring up a state of emergency. That's the phrase he uses. But I think it's better, from my perspective, to actually place it within the Romantic tradition. Think of a figure like William Blake, too. You have that same temporal logic to his ideas of revolution, agitation, etc.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the talk, and I'm certainly appreciating it from the perspective of somebody whose sort of intellectual history involves a sort of intimate engagement with Aimé Césaire and Leopold Sédar Senghor in particular. But what I wanted to ask you about two things. The first of all is just a smaller question, which is the role of nostalgia in relation to both the writing of history and prophecy, which seems to me to play an enormous role in the kind of rhetorics that you're talking about. So it's not just romantic histories, it's a particular, I mean, one of the interesting things about nostalgia is you can feel it without it having a specific object, which means that it's the ultimate kind of, you know, in between continents. In some ways, it has a geography as well as a history. That's one question. But then there's a more pressing question, which is the question of the exclusivity of gender, especially in these romantic, profoundly heterosexual romantic configurations of nationalism. And that's one thing that is inherited by, you know, Fanon, Senghor, and Césaire. And so I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm also kind of slightly, you know, pissed off that you're not speaking about how patriarchal and heterosexual this imaginary is in terms of its legacies, and I wondered if you would speak a little bit about that, because what you do have is something, you know, it's like this is what I hate about some South African fictions as well, anti-apartheid fictions, is sort of the miscegenation for the nation kind of biology, which is just as essentialist in some ways as other forms of biological essentialism. So am I making any sense in that second question?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Yes. It's a very fair question. So I'll tackle the second one first.
Okay, that's great.
I mean, I did mention the question of gender, the gender politics of Betances, and how, and it's a really it's a really profound issue in terms of how Betances and other revolutionaries of the 19th century, including José Martí, constructed their identity of agency, how male, like revolution, I mean, like in parentheses, male revolutionaries versus like the female subject constructed as a passive.
Yeah, you did mention that.
So there's that, but it definitely projects itself onto like the 20th century and particularly movements. Think of like you can also like allude to like
the Negritude movements.
Marcus Garvey too. Michelle Stevens' book Black Empire basically deals with this subject matter, and I really like that book because she confronts the question of the masculine, the hyper-masculinity of these projects of decolonization. So at the same time that I point to what we might salvage from these projects, I think it's important to like point to the limitations. At the end, I mentioned the phrase "great man narratives," and I think that's where I was like going with that idea, and how it also has its own little counter narratives of great men, and how like there's also that history that repeats itself, even in the 21st century, and just like looking back to these heroic figures.
But it's also bizarre because there doesn't seem to be a consciousness from these guys of how the metropolitan center often views the colony as feminized. You know, which you would think would show up even unconsciously in some ways. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't want to hold up your time. You can talk about nostalgia some other time.
Oh, nostalgia, no, I can answer to the, to that very shortly.
Nostalgia seems to have a double temporality of prophecy as well. But it has affect beyond prophecy. Yes.
Of course, you have the construction of a pre-colonial past, and also the romanticization, the idealization of a pure colonial past. And I think there's actually like a problem with when you talk about decolonial theory, decolonial studies. It's like, what does, okay, so on the one hand, I am very much for the theoretical project of questioning and subverting Eurocentric approaches to the subaltern, the third world, the global south, etc., etc. But then, so what happens after that? What are the implications? What happens to discussions, historical discussions about the pre-colonial past, and why that rupture? I mean, of course, there's a rupture. There's a historical break with talking about the Americas and the conquistadors, talk about colonization in Asia and Africa. But there are continuities too, subterranean continuities that connect the pre-colonial past with what happens afterward. And that's actually often not discussed in a lot of people who are engaging questions of decolonization.
Thank you.
Thanks. And sort of following from that question, I've been thinking recently about David Scott's book, Concepts of Modernity, which I don't know if you've read or not, but just for the purposes of this conversation, one of the things that strikes me is that, I mean, his argument would be that when we connect these narratives of, or these romantic narratives of revolutions, when we try to connect that sort of genre to contemporary movements, we run the risk of kind of misreading post-colonial temporality as, for instance, especially with the Haitian Revolution, of because we read it as the kind of romantic fulfillment of this longer history of anti-colonial struggle, we then aren't able to sort of read what happens after that. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about what kind of the genre of romance is doing here, and if, and maybe this also gets back to Jonathan's question that there is a different temporality that is maybe, while it's romantic, also trying to do something different. But how you're sort of seeing this as a precursor to later movements and what you're thinking about that idea of progressive time. Sorry, that's slightly incoherent, but take it in whichever direction you like.
Well, I mean, definitely David Scott and Conscripts of Modernity is an important text in how I'm negotiating with the teacher. I'm actually sometimes I feel that very ambivalent about taking sides in these discussions. And that's a text that's actually it provoked a lot of controversy in just colonial and post-colonial studies in general. And Gary Wilder actually is responding to David Scott in a very explicit way in his book. Because in the end, and I agree with Wilder in this regard, the problem with Scott is actually like following a rational chronology of time. In the way of, he essentially proposes that we need to abandon the romantic tradition to anti-colonial resistance, and we should go forward to what he calls the tragic. The tragic time is the time of post-colonial sovereignty, which that opens a big can of worms in terms of like political projects. How do we define emancipation in contemporary times? And I think it has a lot to do with where he's positioning himself in those debates. In terms of genre, again, it's also problematic because he uses David Scott uses a very atemporal, ahistorical take on what genre is. So he extends the notion of romance to discuss C.L.R. James and other figures that are actually not specific to the emergence of the genre of romance, like he reads the Black Jacobins as a romance, for example, and I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think that has a little to do with the fact that David Scott is an anthropologist, and he's using very interestingly and very, I'm not going to take anything away from him, in trying to engage literary theory, but he uses Hayden White's very mechanical separation between what is romance, what is tragedy, and comedy, right? Following what's his name? It's like I forgot. There's another like literary theories that I'm forgetting, but I mean, actually, the question of romance and how it applies to the present time, that's something that I would have to like think more about, because as a specialist of the 19th century, for the most part, I mean, I do work a little on contemporary like period, but I'm mostly like, my formation in this project like addresses the 19th century. Thus, I'm interested in the conversation that Betances and other Cuban, Puerto Rican, and also like Haitian writers, I've also like written about Antenor Forman, how they're actually in dialogue with the literary and aesthetic production of the time and how they address a politics of anti-colonial revolution.
I think that's a very important idea, because one of the curiosities of genre, as opposed to just simple ideology, right? Genre reproduces itself in its own way. I mean, getting back to Rose's questions, right? I mean, one of the sort of strikes me as one of the great exigencies of post-colonial research is its exigency, and the appeal to a certain kind of instrumentality, right? Here's how we do it. And when you look at the 19th century, right? You're talking about subterranean networks, but the idea of the kind of ready-at-hand instrumentality of anti-colonial thinking that is no longer kind of ideologically consistent with the contemporary, let's say, right? You have a problem, and I think that's an interesting problem to solve. But it does put pressure on the role of genre in self-reproducing, right? I think that's an important recognition. We tend to get very contemporary, right? In our sense of, where the so what question of academia, right? What will this help us fix?
Well, and that's why I'm wondering whether the solution to that might not be a kind of understanding of the operation in the current of post-colonial nostalgia.
Right, which could have its own nostalgia too.
Exactly.
Right? What is the past to which it might beckon?
Exactly.
The right past that it would
Exactly,
have.
which creates these kind of crises or radical breaks in meaning, but which is fine if we recognize they're happening, but half the time we don't. And I think it's because of the nostalgia for, we can talk about it, but it's the nostalgia for the past as being unified in the same way that the romance itself speaks of the pre-colonial past.
Magali, did you have a question? Sure. I don't mean to deviate. I like where this conversation about genre is going, but I'm curious, Kahlila, I like the ways in which this talk has changed since the last time I heard you talk about these particular texts. I'm really enjoying the sort of development. And I wanted to ask about a word, and I'm afraid I really may have asked you a question along these exact same lines the last time. But I justify asking it again, precisely because you use the word cosmopolitan a lot more. And I asked you the question, and you sort of said, well, there's so many problems with this word to qualify the kinds of, sort of transnational modes I'm thinking about that I'm hesitant to use it. Your answer was one about sort of hesitation about embracing the word. And so my question is in some ways, how have you made that word a usable word? Like how is it now operating for you above and beyond the possible problems that invoking cosmopolitanism can invoke for this context?
I mean, I think I'm seeing it more as a neutral concept and defining how maybe neutral is not the exact word. Historically specific. A historically specific conceptualization of the relationship between the anti-colonial project and a vision of the world. It's pretty simple, and in the case of Betances, the connection is, of course, the discourse of the French Revolution of 1848, which appealed to, in different respects, the French Revolution. You cannot really have you have to like go into like a long description of the different political figures, the different political movements that made up the revolution. You had proto-anarchists in Proudhon. You had liberal Republicans. You had and you even had even some figures that could be associated with the worker struggle, and that later, of course, took the form in a broader way from the Marxist tradition. So it's just specific to a very specific understanding of cosmopolitanism in the French context of the period. And unlike some other theorists and thinkers who use this concept, I'm not taking a positive or negative approach to it. Just a very historically specific approach.
Well, I have a really quick question, but I was just wondering if you could speak really briefly to how Betances' ideas on race sort of related to some of the scientific discourse around race at this time. Because I was wondering if this situation with these two brothers and there seems like there's conflicting ideas about inheritance and genealogy. I was wondering if any of that is kind of staging, I don't know, some conflicted views on race and
Well, of course, Betances studied medicine, and an aspect that has not been written about at all in connection to Betances is precisely what you're talking about. And what I've read his medical treatises. He was well respected among the medical community and the scientific community in France, and he published papers in the most important medical journals in France. Mostly wrote about diseases. He wrote about cholera. He wrote about elephantiasis. He also wrote about abortion, forced abortions. And I've tried to trace in those documents a language in regards to scientific racist ideas, and how, of course, this is the time when anthropology was coming to age as a modern discipline in universities. And I mentioned the figure of Antenor Farman and his book on the equality of human races. That book is actually it's a really long. A really long response defending racial equality and referring to race as a social construction, essentially. He's one of the first social constructionists of race. While at the same time he does follow a hierarchy of culture, European culture at the top, of course, and then developmentalist framework of other cultures throughout the world. I'm conflicted about how in Betances the question of race is negotiated with, and is there a discourse of miscegenation in Betances moving towards that? In his political text, pamphlets, there's no reference at all to that discourse. Even in the biography, so the biography he wrote about Alexandre Pétion, there's no description of the physical traits of any of his, which is very common. It's a very common characteristic in historical biographies of the time. He does not refer at all to to those traits. And even in the text, even in the Two Indians, the novella that I discussed, he does not really go into the physical description of the characters. So I think I think it has a lot to do with his own very personal negotiation with his racial identity, the fact that he did not identify himself publicly as of African descent. But there's also probably some connection with discourses on race in the French sciences of the period. It's something that I need to think more about, and I'm sure maybe if I did more archival research in terms of what kind of discussions were going on, alternative discussions that go beyond the conventional eugenics discourse that were happening at the time. So the anti-eugenics debate that was going on, but that's not really talked about.
But one way to do that, if you don't mind my saying, sorry, this is so my field, I'm just jumping in here. Sorry to everybody else. Is about, if you look at what he did, he looked at forced abortion, and elephantiasis, and the third one was cholera. So you're looking at what was then under the category of tropical diseases. My guess is that we'll have a much, instead of looking directly at the question of miscegenation, if you look at the social framing of those diseases within his medical papers, compared to how other people framed tropical disease at that time, you're going to see a racial alignment of some sort. You see what I'm getting at?
That makes sense.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Sorry, I had to. Okay.
Thanks for your comment.
Well, I think we have to end there, but thank you very much, Kahlila, for your talk.